Committee will come to order. Without objection, Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Secretary Ross is with us. He'll be joining us momentarily. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then my friend from Maryland. The census is constitutionally required. It is what ensures that just as every vote should be counted, every person should be counted. This is a condition precedent for accurate redistricting and accurate reapportionment. The census is not only important for purposes of constituting our government, it's also important for apportioning the resources and services of our government. So the census is vitally important for a number of reasons. It is also eminently predictable. There are a few things that can be foreseen, quite like the decennial census. It happens every 10 years, whether you're ready or not. So it's incredibly important, beginning with the fundamental truth of counting every one of our fellow citizens, and we know well in advance when it's coming. So we can't complain that we were caught off guard, and we can't complain that we didn't see it. So we have a couple more years before we actually count everyone, but now is the time to make sure that we are ready to count everyone with accuracy, with security, and with professionalism. We're all concerned with cost. Our fellow citizens are hearing about cuts in a number of areas, and there's concern about the deficit and the debt. So cost is important, but it's also very important that we get this done right, accurately, professionally, with security, and in a fashion worthy of the world's great democracy. What would be even worse than unexpectedly high cost is unexpectedly high costs coupled with less than full success. So we want to make sure the census is a success. We don't appropriate money on this committee, but we do help make sure the right questions are asked in a timely fashion. So for Secretary Ross, I appreciate his time, and I appreciate the time, frankly, that he's given our committee before today, as well as his appearance today. We live in a country that is increasingly skeptical of whether or not we can get things done right, in a timely fashion, in an incredible, responsible way. I think our country as a whole, irrespective of the region in which you may live or your political ideation, would appreciate a good news story. A story of how a government entity was prepared, efficient, and exceeded their expectations. So 2020 may seem like a long ways off, but it's coming. And when it comes, we're going to have counted 300 million plus people accurately. So I think time is of the essence even today. So with that, I would welcome all of our witnesses, especially Secretary Ross, and would yield the remainder of my time to my friend from North Carolina, the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership on this particular issue. And as we go into this hearing today, I think it's critically important that we all realize that while 2020 is a good ways off, we have already missed critical dates, critical testing, and critical implementation that should have already been done according to our own schedule that we have had in previous hearings. Of the IT systems that are out there, there are some 43 IT systems that need to be implemented, and yet today only 4 have actually been fully implemented. Another 31 are only partially done, and 18 have not been delivered in any form or fashion. And yet we continue to have hearings over and over and over again about the critical nature of making sure that we not only get these systems implemented, but tested, and that we do end-to-end testing on a basis to make sure that cybersecurity, other fumbles do not happen. And yet here we are today on another hearing, and I am concerned that the focus will be on the $3 billion in terms of a budget shortfall and not on the other critical mission steps that have to be addressed. And so let's today focus not on the $3 billion, but on the management issues that must be done. And in doing so, we're talking a whole lot about disaster relief in every other area. Today is a day that we need to start talking about disaster relief for what will be a disaster if we don't get on this today. And so, Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming. For our second panel of witnesses, thank you for coming. I've been informed by some of your staff, Mr. Secretary, that you are on this and that you plan to make sure that this is not just a budgetary component, that it is a component that actually looks at the management, procurement, and otherwise. And I was pleasantly assured of that this morning, but we look forward to hearing more from you. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership, and as we get this right, I look forward for this to be a good story in the months and years to come. I yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina yields back. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If there's one key point we can get across to those watching today's hearing, I believe it is simply this. The Census Bureau is dangerously underfunded and has been for years. And unless we do something about it right now, not yesterday, not today, but right this moment, this massive deficiency could imperil the fairness and accuracy of the census itself. Americans expect us to be able to do things right. And I think the chairman would agree with me. I think he just said it. We want to be effective and efficient in whatever we do. Mr. Meadows is right. We've got to, it's not just a thing of money, it's a thing of operation and making sure that things are done properly. So this is not a partisan observation. Both progressives and conservatives agree that current budget projections are way, 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 way too low. Eli Lear, the president of the R Street Institute, wrote an op-ed just this Tuesday warning that the census is, quote, understaffed and underfunded, end of quote, and that, quote, America is in serious danger of the census going wrong, end of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot afford to allow that to happen. This is the United States of America, the exceptional nation. If we cannot count the 300+ million people who are in our country, I don't know how exceptional we will be determined to be. Last month, the Conservative American Enterprise Institute joined with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in warning Congress that current level of flat or near flat funding, quote, is unprecedented and would significantly undercut efforts to conduct an accurate survey, end of quote. They warned that, quote, shortchanging the census is penny-wise and pound-foolish, that it, quote, jeopardizes the Bureau's ability to implement cost-effective new technologies, end of quote, and it, quote, could backfire, costing taxpayers more in the long run, end of quote. I say that we are better than that. I'd like to show a few charts that illustrate this urgent problem. It won't show up on the screen, but members, it will show up on your screens at your desk. First, as we all know, funding for the Census Bureau historically increases dramatically in years 8 through 10 of each decade to accommodate the ramp-up in activities for the census in year 10. The first chart shows funding for the last 4 decades in inflation-adjusted dollars. For the 1990 census, the Bureau increased from $596 million to $3 billion over the last 4 years. For the 2000 census, it increased from $535 million to $6.9 billion over this period. For the 2010 census, it increased from $1.1 billion to $8.4 billion over this period. But what are we doing now? We are basically flatlining. The Trump administration did not request a significant increase for 2018. You can see the same trends when you look at the budget from a percentage basis, which is what this next chart shows. The 1990 census had a massive increase in the last 4 years of the cycle, as did the 2000 census and the 2010 census. But here is where we are now. The administration is not on track to match past increases for 2020. If we use these historical trends to project forward, total Census Bureau funding would be increasing over the next several years. But that is not what is happening. As this last chart shows, there's a shortfall of about $760 million when you compare what the administration is requesting to pass trends. I say that we are better than that. Now, Congress shares part of the blame, no doubt about it. In 2012, Congress insisted that the Census Bureau spend less on the 2020 census than it spent on the 2010 census. Congress refused to acknowledge or budget for two of the most significant and predictable drivers of cost increases that occur between each decennial census: inflation and population growth. Aggravating this problem even more, Congress appropriated even less than the Census Bureau requested in every single year since 2012. Now, some people will argue that the Census Bureau was supposed to save billions of dollars this time around by using new IT innovations to reduce the number of workers it needs to hire and increase the number of people who submit their forms online. The problem is that when you starve the Census Bureau year after year after year, it cannot make the investments needed to implement these innovations. And this is exactly what happened, and I'm sure Secretary Ross will talk about that. As a former director of the Census Bureau, John Thompson, who left his position this summer, explained to the Washington Post just this week, and I quote, "Had we been funded to do everything we asked for then, we'd be much further ahead," end of quote. He continued, quote, "At this point, they're going to have to go back and do some of it the old way, with paper and pencil," end of quote, with paper and pencil. This is the exceptional nation, the one that has done the census over and over and over and over again. Secretary Ross, I want to thank you for being here today and for briefing members of the committee last week. I understand you have limitations on your time, but Mr. Secretary, we beg you to, we have members, and I'm sure the chairman will emphasize this, we have members that are very interested in this subject, and I hope that, I don't know what you, unless you're meeting with the President, I hope that you can spare us a few extra moments, because we do want to get to have members ask. And as I close, and I know you will get into this during your testimony, but I appreciate that as a result of your own team's review, you've also recommended that the administration increase its request for 2018 by $187 million. And thank you for doing that, because so often we have secretaries come in and they don't say exactly what they need because they don't want to get people upset. But this is just too important. I commend you for taking this step, and I know you understand the importance of this issue as a former enumerator yourself. However, I believe that even this request is far too low. Too low. Did you hear me, Secretary? Too low, especially given the number of tests that have been canceled and an extremely low number of hires at the moment. And so I know you are constrained in your current position. I was just amazed to hear that the Office of Management and Budget rejected your request for an additional $50 million for contingencies that are virtually certain to occur. Nevertheless, we have a responsibility under the Constitution of the United States to ensure that the census is funded adequately and that the Census Bureau has the resources it needs to conduct a fair and accurate census. This should matter to each and every one of us, because while we historically discuss minority and immigrant populations being undercounted, low-income and rural communities are also at risk of being missed, particularly in a digital census. For this reason, yesterday I joined my colleague, Representative Carolyn Maloney, who also chairs the Congressional Census Caucus, in introducing legislation to fund the Bureau at $1.935 billion this year, an amount that reflects budget projections from the Bureau's fiscal year 2017 budget and an extra $135 million for increases in the necessary funds for the CCAP program. As I close, we must recognize the gravity of the situation we are facing. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you. Well, you have taken on this matter very, very seriously. As you said earlier, we had a very informative meeting with the Secretary. I think that helped to lay the foundation for this hearing, and I look forward to the testimony. And thank you very much for your indulgence.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back. We want to welcome you, Mr. Secretary. Pursuant to committee rules, I'm going to ask you to please stand and we'll administer the oath. If you'll raise your right hand, you solemnly swear or affirm testimony you're about to give should be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God. May the record reflect the witness answered in the affirmative. You may take your seat, Mr. Secretary. Your entire opening statement will be made part of the record. You'll have 5 minutes to summarize that. I want to say, as Mr. Cummings did, we do appreciate the fact that there are other demands on your time, and we want to be good stewards of your time. The census is one of the unusual entities that is squarely within the jurisdiction of this committee. And there are lots of members that have questions. So what I'm going to ask of my colleagues on both sides is to exercise the self-restraint of getting your questions done within 5 minutes. I'm notoriously slow on the gavel because it's hard to unlock the mysteries of the world in 5 minutes, but I'm going to ask my colleagues to self-discipline and get it done within 5 minutes so everyone can have a chance to interact with you and we can also be a good steward of your time. With that, I would invite you to turn on the microphone and you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, thank you for your continuing support and your discerning oversight. Thank you also for allowing the opening statements to be read while I was reviewing some of the newly developed materials so I could comment on it myself. An efficient 2020 census that provides a full, fair, and accurate count has been one of my highest priorities since being confirmed in February. I myself was an enumerator as I worked my way through business school, and so I have a strong appreciation for the responsibilities and the unique challenges of counting everyone in the United States once every 10 years. Any operation that must hire and manage 500,000 temporary employees with complex and new technological systems and with rigid completion dates is bound to be a difficult undertaking for even the most experienced managers. And it's been clear to me from the beginning of my tenure that census would be one of the most challenging aspects of the entire Commerce portfolio. I agree with the members of this committee. The census is the bedrock upon which we construct our system of democratic representation. It provides for apportionment, redistricting, and the distribution of hundreds of billions of dollars of federal funding. Accordingly, some of my first meetings as the newly confirmed Secretary of Commerce were with the Commerce staff. In those meetings, I sought to identify and then address the key issues faced by the decennial census. My early concerns were heightened when only 2 months into my tenure, the Census Bureau suddenly announced a 40% cost overrun in one component, namely the Census Enterprise Data Collection and Processing, CEDCAP program, a critical part of the technology infrastructure for the 2020 census. In terms of the broader decennial census, the prior administration's last life cycle cost estimate in October 2015 was $12.5 billion. When testifying before Congress in June, I did not accept that figure. Instead, I vowed to return to Congress after a thorough review with a vetted 2020 census life cycle cost that I could support. The product of that review is what brings me here today. As promised, we assembled a team of experts to conduct an independent review of the estimate, and they have come back with numbers I can now stand behind as we continue our preparation for 2020. The team was comprised of financial management experts from the Department of Commerce, from the Office of Management and Budget, former census employees, 2 former technology executives with experience in rolling out complex systems, as well as other experts with extensive private sector experience. In conducting our review, we looked at the many concerns raised by the GAO and members of Congress, including those on this committee, about the Census Bureau's cost estimates. I'm aware of the funding statistics presented by Ranking Member Cummings and can assure you that the $760 billion budget shortfall and its impact is encompassed within our new life cycle projections. You will hear testimony from both the GAO and the Commerce IG discussing their concerns with the prior 2015 life cycle cost estimate. For example, the GAO estimated that the IT budget would be at least $4.8 billion. Our estimate is $4.96 billion, so $160 million over the floor that the GAO estimated would be the correct number rather than the previously used one. I share their concerns, and their testimony will underline the need and justification for this new life cycle cost estimate. GAO also points out that there are 43 technology systems involved in the 2018 end-to-end test. Only 4 of those systems had completed development and integration tests as of August 2017. And of the 39, a portion of the functionality has been deployed in the 2018 end-to-end test, but that is not yet true for the remaining 18. With so much still under development, the need for a contingency to address possible overruns seems self-evident. These are just a few examples. The IG provided another example regarding address canvassing, where they found that it would cost at least 3 times the amount the Census Bureau estimated in 2015. We agree with that, and we have incorporated that into our numbers. On the whole, we found that the prior administration provided Congress and the public with overly optimistic assessments of both the ease of implementing new technologies and the cost savings they would provide. These issues were undoubtedly compounded by initial appropriation constraints. Also, procurement decisions created a series of silos, most of which had a small firm as the general contractor and a number of major firms as subcontractors, a very complex structure. Worse yet, many segments were on a time and materials basis, and in my view, that's the most dangerous form of a contract. The prior administration also failed to follow basic management practices, like using certified cost estimators and checking estimates against actual costs. We have addressed these failures and corrected the record with this new life cycle cost estimate. We identified key areas where census programming would likely create costs above the 2015 estimate. Those include declining self-response rates, increased public concerns about privacy and cybersecurity, high levels of mistrust of the federal government, tightening in the labor market since 2010, development and integration of new technologies, and the complex array of contractors and subcontractors. This leads us to now project a revised life cycle cost estimate of $15.6 billion. The increase includes contingency funding of $1.2 billion to address additional potential risks and associated challenges such as national disasters, potentially even lower self-response rates, the difficulty and cost of hiring 500,000 temporary workers in a tight labor market, and the complexity of developing and integrating multiple information technology innovations. Over 80% of the projected spending, over 80%, will occur post-2018. So it's a very back-ended expenditure, as Congressman Cummings pointed out in his charts. And this rapid ramp-up in the future brings its own challenges to implementation and to cost control. Our $1.2 billion reserve, a contingency of 10% of the post-2018 budget on top of the independent cost estimate level, will be managed at the secretarial level and used only if unforeseen developments occur. A 10% contingency is commonplace in estimating complex private sector projects. Government tends not to set up reserves, but instead funds overruns in subsequent appropriation requests. Our new $15.6 billion 2020 Census Life Cycle cost estimate includes a request for a $187 million adjustment for fiscal year 2018. We are working with our House and Senate appropriators on this request. These funds would allow us to make a significant course correction to keep crucial programs on track and provide much-needed financial oversight and better management at the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau and the Department of Commerce will be held accountable to manage the 2020 census efficiently while maintaining the highest quality. The Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, Karen Dunn Kelly, has been in place since late August and has direct oversight over the 2020 census, the Census Bureau, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. She brings over 3 decades of management experience in the financial investment sector, with experience managing people, strategy, budgets, operations, public relations, and thought leadership across the globe. Seasoned and experienced senior management is also in place at the Census Bureau itself. Ron Jarman, performing the non-exclusive duties and functions of the Director of the U.S. Census Bureau, and Enrique Lamas, performing the non-exclusive duties and functions of the Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Census Bureau, are jointly leading the census, and each has nearly 3 decades of experience in census. Commerce now conducts weekly 2020 census oversight reviews and will require metric tracking and program execution status on a real-time basis. Commerce also has monthly meetings with OMB, census program managers, and Commerce's 2020 leadership team, headed by Undersecretary Kelly, to review issues related to the program's budget, scope, schedule, and risks. These management meetings include detailed reviews of the evolving budget and life cycle cost estimate for the 2020 census. The results of these meetings are reported directly to me by Undersecretary Kelly and her staff, and we maintain a free flow of access and information so that I can personally oversee the progress of the decennial. We are now just 30 months away from the 2020 census. There are still many challenges ahead, and these additional resources I have described are urgently needed. But with the changes I have detailed and with the additional resources requested, I am confident we will have a full, fair, and accurate census. I look forward to working with this committee, your staff, and the rest of Congress over the months and years to come. And I thank the committee for the opportunity to come before you today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us. And I have 2 questions. I'll just ask them both so we get them in. Many of us who were here at the time of the last census received a lot of complaints about this American Community Survey, and some privacy advocates were very critical. And our colleague, Ted Poe, has led a charge against this. He called that survey, quote, an unnecessary and completely unwarranted government intrusion, and he's led a charge to make that survey voluntary. And I'm wondering if you have looked into that to see if you can make that survey a little less intrusive so that we won't get as many complaints this time as we did the last time. And secondly, the second question I have is many states are going to be trying to do everything they can to make sure that they don't lose a member of Congress, or maybe that they pick up one, and many federal appropriations are based on population. Can you assure us that steps are being taken, or are you satisfied that things are being done so no states can inflate their populations in those kinds of, with the goal of getting more money or another congressional seat?
Well, thank you. Those are 2 questions. I'll try to answer them in sequence. The American Community Survey is one of the Department of Commerce's most valuable data products, and it's widely used in the business community to make decisions. A voluntary survey would have a negative effect on the reliability of the data, especially for rural and small communities. At the same time, the Census Bureau continues to look for ways to reduce the burden on respondents, such as removing questions by using other data sources, including information that people have already provided to government in a different form. So we're trying to reduce the scope of the burden as a means of making it easier for people. In terms of trying to assure that we really do count everyone, we've made a number of changes. First of all, the communications budget for the 2010 decennial census was $350 million, and that included outreach to non-primary English-speaking communities. We have increased that budget to $500 million this year, or for 2020, and that equates to an inflation-adjusted $420 million that would have been in 2010. So we've had a material step up in the communications budget. And in the 2010-2020 census, about half of that will go for our partnerships, the various faith-based and other community organizations that help us get to the more difficult to enumerate parts of the population. So we are keenly aware of the need for even greater effort than was used before. And finally, we have added internet response as an additional tool to make it more convenient for that portion of the population that likes to use internet. So we've made a number of very specific modifications, all of which we believe will lead to the end result of a more accurate and more complete census.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland.
In 2012, Congress directed the Bureau to spend less than the 2000 census, and I quote, not adjusting for inflation, end of quote. Since that time, Congress has basically starved the Bureau of funds and has appropriated less than the Census Bureau requested in every single fiscal year since 2012. This must have negatively affected the Bureau's investments in new technologies. Is that right? In other words, did it affect your investment in new technologies, sir?
Well, the expenditures you're describing, if I understand it correctly, are the ones prior to the present period. And I have seen the chart, and it roughly parallels, even though the distribution year by year isn't the same, the 2021 roughly parallels the expenditures for the 2010 census. The 2020 census is heavily back-ended, as were the prior ones, but it's even more so because of the nature of the technological changes that we're making. So if you would superimpose on your chart and in the supplemental material that I file after today, I'll fill in the blank for you and show you how our projected budget for 2020 would compare both with the fluctuations, the amplitude in the prior ones, and you'll see we are coming to a significantly higher absolute level than they had been.
Okay. Well, in previous decades, this is the year 8, when there are larger funding increases as the Census Bureau historically ramps up towards Census Day. However, the Trump administration did not seem to recognize this precedent earlier this year. The president requested only a 1.8% increase in funding for the Bureau in fiscal year 2018. Is that right?
I believe so, and I believe that was based on the information he then had from the prior management of census.
Well, you presented our committee with data last week showing that this level of funding is inadequate and could impair our ability to provide for a fair and accurate census. You are now requesting an additional $187 million to make up for what your department termed a, quote, shortfall, end of quote, in the budget request for fiscal year 2018. Is that figure correct?
Yes, sir. I believe we do need 187 million more than was in.
And OMB supports that request? Is that right?
I'm sorry?
And OMB supports that request?
That's my understanding.
You also informed the committee last week that you, at the Commerce Department, as well as the Census Bureau, believe that you need more than that amount to fully be prepared for all eventualities. You asked for an additional $50 million to cover contingencies that almost certainly will occur. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
But OMB denied this correct. Is that request? Is that right? For the contingencies.
I don't know that they have taken a position on the overall life cycle cost. Our focus, because of the urgency of the budget, had been on getting their support for the immediate request for an additional appropriation.
Do you know whether that came to the attention of Mr. Mulvaney?
Oh, it's been brought to Mr. Mulvaney's attention by me.
And I see I'm running out of time, but do you know if the President is aware of your request for the additional $50 million?
I have not personally spoken to the President about it.
Last question. So what will happen if problems arise? How will you obtain funding to cover them?
Well, we believe that the $187 billion will cover us through the fiscal year 2018. We're reasonably comfortable with that. The bigger risk comes after 2018 because that's when 80% of the money will be spent.
Right.
So 2018, we think, is pretty high visibility, pretty well within hand. It's post that period that needs the big contingency.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Comer from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Bureau's contracts, I'm going to ask a question about the contracts, are set up as time and material contracts, which means there are limited incentives for contractors to control labor hours and costs. To your knowledge, what was the thinking behind this type of contract?
I have no idea, sir. I've been less worried about re-exploring the past than about trying to make sure we get our arms around the future.
What do you think the department can do to manage these contracts more effectively?
Well, we're interacting quite aggressively with the contractors, and that's about all that we can really do. Many of the contracts have very severe cancellation provisions and would be very disruptive to cancel at this stage in the game in any event. So I think we have to manage through the process pretty much with the existing group of contracting parties. But the intensity of interaction, I can promise you, is a lot more than it had been.
Okay. Well, one more quick question, Mr. Secretary. With respect to IT, are you concerned that certain IT products and systems may not be delivered in their final form in time for testing during the 2018 end-to-end test?
So far as we can tell, the ones that are incomplete are reasonably on schedule, but it's always the last 10% that's the devil. It's just like in any contract, the devil's in the details.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's an honor to have you here. I'm a big fan of yours when you were on CNBC a lot over the years, but I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Maloney.
Thank you. First of all, Secretary Ross is from the great state and city of New York, and I'd like to welcome you here today and thank you for your public service. In your comments, you seem very committed to getting an accurate count, which is mandated in our Constitution. But if you look at the spending levels, granted you're just new in this job, but for the census for 2020, the spending, the red line is way behind, you know, the prior censuses from 2010, 2000, and 1990. And as a businessman...
Could you raise the chart a bit? I can't see the whole thing.
You know what? Let's take it down and give him one of these. But anyway, this is a chart that we have on it, on the ratio of the census budget to year one of the decade. But in any event, as a businessman, it's hard to achieve the results without spending. So I certainly support your spending request of $187 million, and I think it's a good start, but I don't think it's good enough. You have a lot to catch up on. Several of the dress rehearsals were canceled, the foreign language rehearsals canceled. This is a major undertaking. It's one of the major undertakings of our country. And if we don't have a good census, you know we don't have good data for government policy or business policy. So I want to know what you're doing to address the immediate problem. And as I understand it, your increase of $187 million is basically for IT work. But in your new life cycle estimate, you identified 7 major cost drivers, and the first 2 of these are all about public confidence, public response, and public concern. And these cost drivers can be addressed through education and outreach and promotion of the census, and we've seen that before. The 1990 census was called a failure because there was a declining response rate. So in 2000, the 2000 census, the Congress allocated more money and called for a paid advertising campaign and for partnership outreach and all types of efforts to build up participation. And both in 2000 and 2010, we were successful in increasing the public response rate, which is what it's all about, getting people to participate. But by getting the public response rate up, it was critical in keeping the expensive follow-up methods that you have to do if there is an undercount. So that's very important. Now, I read recently in the Washington Post that the ad contract Congress mandated for the 2020 has not been funded yet, and the partnerships have not been fully filled. And this, the census has to start early to be successful. So these partnerships with communities like the NAACP, like La Raza, like the Hispanics and LGBT community, you have to fill those contracts, and they haven't been filled with people yet, as I understand. And nowhere in your testimony or your documents do you propose fully funding the ad contract as originally planned, let alone increasing the contract to start addressing the later start in tracking these cost drivers that you identified in public outreach. So yesterday, I am supporting your efforts, Mr. Secretary. I introduced the 2020 American Census Investment Act, which would provide more funding for the census and mandate that funds be used on promotion, education, outreach, in addition to the IT that you are addressing. And I just would like to hear your comments on now, on whether or not you will be funding. By the way, I want to thank Chairman Cummings for, Ranking Member Cummings, for supporting the bill and the efforts to increase funding for it. And do you feel that, will you be funding the ad contract? Will you be funding the partnership outreach? Will you be funding education and outreach to get participation up in the census?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Maloney. I'm not used to being granted more money than I asked for, so that's a totally new experience for me.
We want to make sure we get an accurate account, and as you look at this chart, we're way behind spending in the prior censuses in this decade.
Well, as I said earlier to Ranking Member Cummings, we believe that cumulative shortfall of the $760 million and its impact on the overall program is made up for by the funding we've requested in the total life cycle cost.
Will you be investing in promotion and education and advertising?
We're investing in all sorts of things. For one thing, our communications budget will be $500 million as opposed to the $350 that was spent in 2010. Inflation adjusting the 2010 would bring it to $420. So we're running $80 million more than on an inflation-adjusted basis than the 2020. In addition,
My time is almost up. The economic survey, is that on track, the economic survey?
I think so far, but that's not the most urgent part of the problem of the communications. What we're doing is several things. We have more ways that people can respond than ever before. We're doing more language training than before. For example, we've introduced telephone call centers, and they will have the capability of operating in 10 languages, naturally including Spanish, but our population is more diverse than just that. So the call centers will be able to do up to 10 languages. In addition, the census enumerators will be able to provide support through the nature of people we select in multiple languages. We're trying to match the characteristics of the enumerators to the characteristics of the population in the area that they will be surveying. As to the partnerships, we certainly agreed that those are a big key, and those will include national organizations, state and local governments, churches, and other faith-based organizations, health clinics, legal aid centers, and other support mechanisms. So we're trying to work with all of those, and the partnership program will consume approximately half of the $500 million budget for communications. It's about $248 million will go for the partnerships. So we believe that we are dealing adequately with the need for those.
The gentlelady.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm over here in the corner, Secretary Ross, other direction.
Oh, sorry.
Got a couple of questions for you. It seems to me that the Census Bureau has this attitude of we've got to do it ourselves and aren't looking to products that may be already out there or companies that you might be able to contract with to save some money. For instance, it's my understanding that the Census Bureau has received numerous recommendations, including some from the GAO and the Census Scientific Advisory Committee, as well as the private sector, how the Census Bureau could better use commercial mapping and GIS, that's Geographic Information Technologies, which would yield a large cost saving and increase productivity. However, to date, the Census Bureau doesn't appear to have recognized or implemented any of these recommendations. How come we haven't been looking at some things like that?
Well, there were very many private organizations contacted in the original process. I can't vouchsafe the process by which they made the final selections they did. That, as you know, basically occurred years before. But we're dealing with the contracts that we do have. We believe that these are qualified people, and we believe that we will be able to get the job done if we get the additional funding that we have requested.
Well, can you maybe provide
in terms of lessons learned, one of the things we intend to do as we go along is to keep careful track of further improvements that should be made in subsequent censuses. I think with only having 30 months between now and then the 2020 decennial, making radical changes would probably guarantee that we didn't get it right.
I'm a little concerned about the path we're on, not getting there too. But if you could get me a list of some of these proposals and recommendations, I sure would like to take a look at them. I mean, just as an old computer guy, we do the census every 10 years, and there are very few computer systems that have an effective life beyond 10 years. So we're going to gear up with this new computer system in 2020, and here we are in 2030, we're going to be sitting here doing the exact same thing, when it seems to me you could get with a cloud service that's secure. We've got those that the government uses now, and get an application written for people's phone, and this seems a whole lot simpler. And this cloud service that we would use would buy the computers and size them the way they need to be sized so they worked, and then when we're done with needing that massive capacity, they're there for them to use for their other clients. And to me, that just makes economic sense, rather than trying this government attitude of we've got to do everything ourselves, especially in IT, where I think the government really struggles. We're damned by some of our own contracting laws on that. It just seems like this is a great opportunity to look for some cost savings. And it's something I brought up to your predecessors several years ago, but apparently it fell on deaf ears. So
well, we do believe that the costs will come in below the inflation-adjusted costs of the 2010 census, notwithstanding that there are the overruns. My predecessors estimated that the inflation-adjusted cost of 2020 using the 2010 methodology would have been $17.5 billion. So we're more than $1 billion below that with all the problems that have occurred. Second, in terms of using existing databases, we do where we can. For example, we're making a lot of use of administrative records, the postal system records, local the IRS records, Social Security records to check IDs, things of that sort. But the truth is, Americans are a very mobile population. Something like 12% relocate each year.
And if I'm running out of time, I do want to make one more comment. I do think the Postal Service is an unused government resource. It could be of more help to the census than I think they're currently used. You've got Postal Service employees that visit almost every American resident 5-6 times a week. So I think there's a great resource there that may be underutilized. My time has expired, but if you'd like to comment further, I'm sure the chairman will.
Oh, we are. We're using the Postal Service, and as I say, the IRS, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare records, the Indian Health Service, every database that we can imagine, because we really are trying to make sure we count everyone and that we count everyone one time.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy, and also thank you, Secretary Ross, on the top, for your testimony.
Sorry, I don't know the geography of the committee well enough to know where everybody's sitting.
I understand. And really, the census is about three things: money, information, and power. And no community or state wins if we fail to get this right. And our nation will be the ultimate loser. And as you all know, our country is more mobile, as you said, and much more diverse than ever before. And sadly, in some parts of our nation, residents have a high level of distrust for the federal government, which makes them less inclined to take part in the census. That's true in urban communities like the one that I represent in St. Louis, which always struggles with a lower self-reporting response. And generally across the nation, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, new immigrants, and the rural poor are at a much greater risk of not being counted. A costly mistake they will pay for an entire decade. And that's why the underfunding the Census 2020 outreach programs to hard-to-count groups is such an enormous bipartisan threat to every state and every district that we represent. And I guess I want to start the line of questioning following up on Ms. Maloney's questioning. Hard to count, hard to reach audiences, and lack of funding for this initiative, Mr. Secretary, which is part of your communications contract, must receive the full attention of your administration. And I say that because the component of the communications contract they need to be made full partners in the communications effort because that's where the challenge will be on how we get to those hard to count populations. So if I could just hear your concerns about that and where we're going with it.
Surely. The entity overall in charge of communications is Young and Rubicam,
Yes.
which also was involved in the 2020 decennial. So first of all, we have the institutional knowledge that they gained by their role 10 years ago. Second, they have retained something like 15 individual firms that specialize either in different forms of media or different ethnic groups. So we tried to pinpoint. Further, I may not have made it clear in what I said before, but the $500 million of communications is in addition to the $248 million for the partnerships. So altogether, we're spending $748 million on this outreach initiative. And when you consider how many total households there are, that's quite a bit per household. And if you take out of that the ones that are easy responders, you'll find we're spending an enormous amount per household on the ones that are difficult to reach. And that's quite a deliberate thing. We have been conservative in our estimate of those who will give voluntary response. Last census was 63.5%. We're assuming that that may drop down to 55%. So we've assumed, despite massive communications, we've assumed that a higher percentage of the population will still need the foot soldiers clogging around, ringing doorbells.
Sure. And your partnership program also calls for testing of communications methods, all communications
Yes,
elements.
Yes, sir.
And that has been canceled for 2018. So how will these elements be tested?
Well, it hasn't been canceled. It's just been postponed.
It's been postponed, but
Yeah.
so in sometime in the calendar year of 2018,
Yes.
it will be tested.
Yes.
And I thank you for that response, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate you being here, Mr. Secretary. Who is responsible to deliver the IT products on time?
Who is responsible? Well, the Census Bureau is responsible. Then they have a whole series of contracting parties. If you count them all up, they're probably 100 individual entities.
But at the end of the day, somebody's got to be responsible that the product is delivered.
Well, ultimately, me at Commerce and Karen Dunn Kelly as the oversight of Census.
So why are the IT products not delivered on time? What is the holdup? For
the
delivery of the modernization IT products, why here we're going to end and we don't have what we need?
Well, I think the original estimates as to how long it would take and how much it would cost to get to those products were flawed. So some of it may be contractor not performing as well. I can't judge what went on prior to the present, but I think it's a combination of over-optimism on the part of Census and maybe some errors on the part of the contractor.
So is there any accountability, is there any penalty for not delivering on time what was promised to be delivered?
Well, each contract is different, but when you're on a time and materials contract, the concept of penalty doesn't really work very well.
So we're just going to have ambitious, we hope to deliver, but we won't deliver, and there's no accountability.
There's not as much accountability as there would have been if there were fixed price, fixed time contracts, but that's not the situation that we're faced with.
So when can we possibly even guess under these circumstances that we'll receive what we have?
Well, we've given more than what we think is a guess. We've done lots of work out in the field. We've done lots of analysis of what's been done thus far, lots of analysis of the contracts, and we believe that this budget, phased in the way that we have proposed, will deliver the product that we need.
Well, I don't share your optimism. I don't see how in the world you can either with the type of situation we're dealing with. And then you look at cybersecurity. How confident are you that this information gathered with an IT that hasn't even been tested is going to be secure?
Well, in today's world, you can't be sure of anything in terms of cybersecurity, but I can assure you the systems we're putting in are far more robust than anything that has ever been done before in Census.
Well, I know last year the CIO for Bureau made a similar statement, said he had great confidence that the cybersecurity was intact, and yet the system hadn't even been tested. How in the world can you have that kind of confidence on something we know nothing about?
Well, first of all, I didn't say I have confidence that it's impenetrable. What I said is it's a lot more robust than had been true in 2010.
How do you know that, is my question?
Because of discussions with the people who are doing the implementation of it. But having said that, I'm not aware that there's any system that's flawless.
Sir, so you are giving great confidence to us about the cybersecurity based on conversation.
No.
Conversation is not enough to give us the assurance that this information is protected.
What I'm telling you, sir, is that the systems themselves will be far more robust than anything Census has used before.
And yet we've not seen those systems.
Well, no, because they're works in progress.
So it's all based on conversation, not on tests. This is all part of the problem. We get promises that are never delivered on, and now we have cybersecurity promises, commitments, the most robust thing we've ever seen before, but it's simply based on conversation, not on tests. It looks to me like we're going to go back to the same thing that happened in 2010 when we were promised all kinds of modernization, but it was a faulty IT program, so we end up a paper-based census. I don't see how we can proceed with this any further without going back to paper-based and just be honest with what we're dealing with.
Well, it's impossible to test something that doesn't yet exist.
My point precisely.
80% of the spending will be post-2018. But let me describe to you what it is that we are doing. All of the data on the census systems are being protected. We're applying some rigorous security protocols to the perimeter of the Census' own network. Census has an existing network. So we're applying rigorous protocols to that. We're putting in routers and firewalls. We also have our own detection, intrusion, and prevention systems in place at Census. Census Bureau now has an unprecedented level of engagement with the best resources elsewhere in the federal government. We're working closely with cybersecurity experts across the department, including NIST, which is part of Commerce, the Federal CIO's Office, the Department of Homeland Security, and the intelligence and law enforcement communities. We're also putting a new level of cybersecurity federal management in place for the 2020 census over and above what was done in 2010.
Mr. Secretary, all due respect, our time is gone. I know we want to respect the time. I appreciate your answers, but they just sound like talking points to me with not much beyond that. I yield back.
You can't test something that isn't in place.
All right. The gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this committee hearing. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Good, ma'am.
Good. I wanted to ask you some questions, which of course are something that is on the minds of quite a number of Americans right now, is undertaking census in areas that have recently been ravaged by disaster, and the mechanisms and processes that are potentially in place to be able to do that. We know that millions of Americans have been displaced by Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria in the states of Texas, Florida, and then the areas of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. As the communities work tirelessly to rebuild, large-scale changes are likely to occur that I would assume would greatly impact the 2020 census. If we've learned anything from Hurricane Katrina in 2005, it is that recovery from large-scale natural disasters take time, and often quite a lot of that time. A 2011 report by the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights illustrated that challenges to enumeration activities still exist in the Gulf region in 2010, almost 5 years after Katrina took place. And the report highlighted issues such as large numbers of individuals in temporary housing, informal housing arrangements, high rates of vacant units, significant changes in both new housing stock and population shifts in those affected areas. Mr. Secretary, do you agree that the Bureau is likely to encounter many, if not all, of these challenges due to the destruction caused by this year's hurricanes and perhaps future hurricanes before the census takes place?
Well, you're surely right in pointing out issues. Here's what we're doing. During the 2010 census, they changed the operations in the areas that were hit by Katrina and Rita. Basically, what it involved was putting more people on the ground to deliver questionnaires directly to housing units and updating the addresses while doing so. We can do something similar in 2020 as needed. If it does turn out that we need that, it will cost more money, but we've tried to allow an amount for these types of contingencies, provided that the natural disasters are not more extreme than we've experienced in the past. In addition, we have a particular problem in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and for that matter in Puerto Rico. We conduct the decennial census in those territories by working directly with territorial governments to build and implement the operations that best fit their respective situations. We're currently developing our approach for the 2020 with the government of the Virgin Islands, and will ensure that the operations take into account the impact of the recent hurricanes.
Excuse me, sir, when you say particular challenges, what have you seen in the past as being uniqueness of trying to find census data in areas like Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, besides the obvious that I know, which is that we don't have street addresses?
Right. Well, as you know, the census has confronted those basic problems over and over and over. So every time that they've gone through it, they've learned something from the process. The difficulty we have now is that the issue of residents has been terribly compounded by the awful destruction that occurred. So the magnitude of the task has become greater than it ever had been.
And will your budget reflect the magnitude of these hurricanes?
We have tried our best to do so.
And I know in the past that you've done a good job of not just partnering with the local governments, but with community organizations as well, that they have been somewhat of boots on the ground for you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why we've allocated $248 million for partnerships with local community organizations.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentlelady from the Virginia line yields back. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. I understand some of the frustration that my colleagues have expressed. And to give you an example, the GAO and the Office of Inspector General have cited a number of issues with the Census Bureau that honestly you inherited, to be totally truthful about it. But the frustration is that these don't appear to have been adequately addressed. For instance, the GAO included the 2020 census on its high-risk list for 2017. In fact, over the last 3 years, they've issued 30 recommendations. But as of January of this year, only 6 have been implemented. Are you familiar with this list?
Well, we have been working closely with the GAO. You will be hearing from them a bit later, and we are cooperating with them in their audit of the work that we've been doing.
Mr. Secretary, we only have 5 minutes, and I want to give you an opportunity to answer. This is a yes or no would be sufficient. Are you familiar with this list of 30 recommendations?
I couldn't hear you, sir.
Are you familiar with this list from the GAO, the 30 recommendations that they've made over the last 3 years?
Sure.
And you're aware that only 6 have been implemented, have been followed up on as of January of this year?
As of January, that was true. I believe there's been some further progress since then, and there will be continuing progress.
I think it's extremely important that when the GAO or the OIG make recommendations, when they have findings of issues, that federal agencies, federal departments act on them. I mean, it's frustrating to the folks who are doing the work. It's frustrating to us in our oversight capacity. And it's not just with the Census Bureau. This has occurred in other agencies, but there's a mounting frustration that we identify problems and they don't get addressed. So my question to you, sir, is this a top priority, mid-level? I mean, how serious are you taking these?
Well, it certainly is a top priority, and I think you'll find the OIG testimony pretty well mirrors the top management challenges report that we put together. What happened prior to January of this year, I can't account for. I was confirmed February 28th.
I realize that, and I made that clear, that you inherited most of these problems. But the thing that we want to know is that under your leadership, that this is taken seriously. I mean, the cost estimates, for instance, we've known this. The GAO began questioning that in 2008.
No, it certainly is. And my testimony today focused on a lot of it. One of their recommendations is the Bureau needs to manage the risks of implementing innovation. Well, you heard my testimony. I totally agree with that. And we're much more heavy-handed in the management than there had been before. Second, the Bureau continues to face challenges in implementing and securing key IT systems. 100% true, for sure. And the 2018 end-to-end test will probably reveal some more deficiencies that we'll have to deal with.
Well, my colleague from Georgia expressed frustration with the testing process, and I appreciate your response that you can't test a system until the system's in place, but
Right. And
we've had, the Bureau's had a number of problems in terms of failing to adequately test systems and products, and when they do test them, they're not using the results to inform their decision-making.
well, we will.
Well, that's comforting to know, and I am certain under your leadership that that will happen. But that's one of the frustrations, again, that we have, is that you have the GAO, the OIG, this committee making recommendations, and it's not just the Commerce Department or the Census Bureau. This has happened a number of times with other agencies. But we want to make sure, this is such a serious issue, we want to make sure that systems are tested and the results are used in decision-making. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to submit the questions, and I yield back.
And the IT part was a very key one in the GAO recommendations. And as I had mentioned earlier, our budget is more than what they felt was the minimum required. They came in thinking that, as opposed to, I think it was 3.6 that the former administration had estimated, I think they recommended 4.8 or more. We came in at $4,960,000. So we are not ignoring any of those recommendations, not by a long shot.
The gentleman from Alabama yields back. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Ross, thank you so much for being with us today. You've already talked about undercounted populations, but this issue has been in the news recently because of a lawsuit filed by the NAACP, which it filed in part because of concerns about the undercount of communities of color, young children, home renters, low-income persons, and rural residents. I am concerned that the undercount could be exacerbated in 2020 if minority groups are less inclined to share personal information with the government due to the climate of mistrust created by this administration's immigration policy. Secretary Ross, can you assure immigrant families and other, it's a bad word, but marginalized groups that their data will be kept confidential and not used to pursue any law enforcement or immigration action?
I believe it would be illegal for those data to be used for other purposes. So unless someone commits a crime, I don't think that's going to happen. But on the NAACP lawsuit, they filed a Freedom of Information Act request with us on the 29th of June.
Secretary Curley, excuse me, or Ross, excuse me just a second. So you're saying if the information was used for law enforcement purposes or for immigration policies, that would be illegal?
My understanding is that the information about specific individuals is not to be used for any other purpose. But
and using it would be illegal. I'm just trying to understand it. That's what you're saying.
I'm not a lawyer, so I can't parse that. But as I understand it, it is not to be used for any other purpose.
Okay. You know, one way, I know you've also spoke about partnership programs, and certainly I believe that additional programs of that nature may lessen some of the concern. How many partnership specialists have you hired, and how many do you anticipate hiring by Census Day?
Oh, there are quite a few. Let me see if I can get you the exact number.
Okay, and while you're looking for that, I think my colleague, Mr. Clay, talked about testing of new processes,
Okay.
particularly—
The answer is 40 people.
40, and how many do you anticipate hiring by Census Day, or is that the total number?
40, I believe, is the total number.
Okay.
To date.
To date, okay. Thank you very much. Any anticipated numbers by Census Day at this point?
Well,
we aren't sure.
We'll see how much comes in. A lot of firms, a lot of community organizations are well aware of the census, have participated in it before, and are signing up themselves. So depending on whether we get a good flow consistent with improving it over the last time, that'll determine how many people are needed.
Okay, thank you for that. I know you also spoke about testing of new procedures. I'd like to talk particularly about in rural, island, and tribal areas, and also tying those procedures to the budget constraints that we currently face. Secretary Ross, what are you doing to ensure that these new processes will work smoothly in rural, island, and tribal areas?
Well, the tribal areas are one of the specific segments that are being tested so that we can get real-world results, seeing how the procedures that we've introduced work.
Okay, and for rural and island?
Same.
Okay, same, okay. Thank you very much for that. On the census website, it says, and I quote, "We promise that we will use every technology, statistical methodology, and physical security procedure at our disposal to protect your information," unquote. Could you talk, Secretary Ross, a little bit about how the adequate or inadequate funding might affect that promise?
Well, we believe that the funding we have requested will provide us the resources we need for that purpose.
And if you do not get the funding that you requested, are you still able to fulfill the promise that is on your website?
Well, we will do the best we can with the resources we get, but we think that the optimal amount for the proper job is the amount we've requested.
Thank you, Secretary Ross. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady from Florida yields back. The gentleman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy. Secretary Ross, thank you for being here today. Good to see you again, my friend. 15.6 billion, I guess, is the latest estimate. In Iowa, that's a lot of money.
It is to me too, sir.
125 million households, I think there are. So the math, if I'm correct, is about $125 per household.
That's about right.
To do what we want to do. Does that strike you as a large number per household?
It
what are your
is
feelings
a
about
large
that?
number, and it's even a larger number when you consider that the vast bulk of that is spent on getting the last few million in, because the ones who respond to the initial mailed document or respond over internet, the cost of those is very small. It's the more difficult to enumerate people that are really the most expensive to get to. The last few million people are going to cost infinitely more than the first few million. And that's why the response rate is so critical.
You're a private sector guy. I'm a private sector business person as well. Can you just, in 60 seconds, let me know how much, are we utilizing the private sector? I'm thinking of, for example, Google. Probably didn't spend $15 billion to map the entire United States visually. And are we utilizing the technology and the resources available in the private sector to the extent possible?
I believe so. I believe so.
Can you expand on that just briefly, or especially the technology piece of this?
Right. Well, where the Google-type technology is helpful is in locating physical structures. It doesn't really go within the structure to the individual person. So our task is first to identify the physical structures that have residents in them, whatever the nature, whatever the formality or informality of the living arrangements. But then the real test is to get inside them and find out exactly how many people are there. So that's where the self-responses are very helpful, and we're providing for internet self-response. We're providing call centers to make it easy. Everybody's going to be getting mailings. And then finally, as a last resort, we'll use the primitive thing of a guy knocking on the door.
And speaking of, I'm glad you said a guy knocking on the door. Back in my district in Iowa, I've delivered the mail with postal carriers. One of them brought up an idea to me. They said, why doesn't, when we do the census, why don't they use us more? He said, for example, I know exactly on my route how many people live in each house. I know their names. He said, I know a lot about them. He said, why don't they utilize us? I said, that was a great question. I'd like to pose that to you.
Oh, we do. Our fundamental database is the postal system, no question. But because people move, people die, all kinds of things happen. Something like 12% of the population relocates during the course of a calendar year. And within the more difficult to enumerate portion, there's probably even more mobility than there is, say, in single-family home in a little town. So it's very, very complicated, but we do begin with the postal system records, for sure.
So you use their database. Can we also utilize the man knocking on the door? Can we utilize the postal carrier for that?
The man knocking on the door is the last resort. Only when all the more efficient mechanisms have already been used.
I got looking at the $15.6 billion, and I thought, Mr. Secretary, if you and I formed a company, I'm guessing we could do it for $8 billion, save the government $7, and you and I would put a few dollars in our pocket, I'm guessing. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I don't know. We are where we are, and we do think under the circumstances we really need the 15.6.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here, Mr. Secretary. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Iowa yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Gowdy, I want to express my appreciation for this hearing. People don't think about the census that much, but it is such an important thing. It's not just because it's constitutionally mandated that we need to get it right. We need to get it right so our American federal government can work better for everybody. We need an accurate census. We need to know where the people are. We need to know where the jobs are. We need to know where the poverty is. We need to know how the economy is changing. We need to know what the government needs to do and maybe needs to stop doing, and where these things need to happen. So much of policy depends on an accurate census. We need to get it right. Secretary Ross, it's good to see you again. I saw you in May when you came and testified before the House Appropriations Committee. And I want to touch on some areas that we do have concerns about. I think all of us in this room share the concern. We need to get this census right. We want to learn from past mistakes. We don't want to be, we don't want to have rose-colored glasses and really unjustified hopes. We need to be very practical and pragmatic about this, and I think you're that kind of person, Secretary Ross. So I want to touch on a few things. First, warning signs of trouble. I mean, May 3rd was when Census Director Thompson appeared before my subcommittee on appropriations, and we asked him hard questions, much like the ones you're getting here today, Secretary Ross, and he resigned the next week. That's a warning sign of trouble to me. And he hasn't been replaced. First question, are there immediate plans to replace the Census Director?
Yes. We had actually come up with a nominee, and then that fell away during the vetting process, so we're actively trying to recruit. But I have very good confidence in the team that we have assembled right now, namely the two people who collectively have some 30 years each of experience, are there. They're functioning every day. And Karen Dunn Kelly now is providing very direct oversight of them. Plus, I'm being very personally involved, and we have the whole series of oversight meetings with the contractors. We're all over this thing as best we can be. So it's not to say that we don't want to have a permanent approved census director. We do, and we will. It's not an easy task to fill because you need someone who has subject matter command and management experience to deal with an enormously challenging task of hiring 500,000 temporary workers, getting them out there, getting them productive, and getting this big technological change introduced.
Well, you have a lot of other things that demand your attention, Secretary Ross, so I urge you to devote the maximum effort into finding that person to be a strong, active, knowledgeable census director, and let's get that done quickly.
We're trying our very best.
Now, we need to get this census right, and one of the problems, one of the red flags is we know there are underreported communities. And there are a number of them have been mentioned by my colleagues on both sides of the aisle today. But one of them I've noticed is the LGBT community. They are historically underreported. We know that they face higher levels of poverty, particularly older LGBT people, that LGBT young people are more likely to be homeless, making it all the more likely that they will be not counted. And in fact, the Census Bureau itself has recognized that the LGBT community is a hard-to-count population, yet the Bureau has declined to put questions about sexual orientation and gender identity into the census. Secretary, did you determine that there was no federal need for this information?
No, there were hearings held about it. There were requests put in, and it was concluded that that particular set of questions did not meet the requirements for being put in. One of the problems with adding questions is it reduces response rates. It may seem counterintuitive, but the more things you ask in those forms, the less likely you are to get them in. So well, there's a balancing act between more information and fewer responses.
Secretary Ross, my time is up, but I want to associate myself with the hard questioning you got from my colleague, Congressman Heiss of Georgia. I urge you to devote a great deal of attention to the online, the self-reporting, increasing public confidence in the cybersecurity of this system, because as you've said yourself today, that's the cheapest way we get this job done, with the self-reporting, with the online work, and I urge you to devote a lot of attention to increasing the public's trust in the online system and giving them good reason to have trust in that system. And with that, I yield back, Mr.
We share your concern.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized. Sorry about that. The gentleman from Texas, I apologize. And I do want to say this in Will's defense. He was up several times ago when he let others go. So, Will, I apologize. You're up. And then the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Chairman. And Secretary Ross, it's great to have you here. And it's great to know that there's C-suite attention to this important issue. You have a very important portfolio. But it's great that you're involved in providing leadership for this. And I know you have inherited, I think the technical term is a mess, and I recognize and I appreciate your comments about how to prevent the next census from being in a similar position. So I appreciate that. And when some of your predecessors were here last time, there was a debate about whether the Census Bureau should develop a widget that uses the telecommunications backbone that the enumerator can put data in. And the question was, that widget already exists. It's called a smartphone. And I'm glad to know that the Census Bureau decided to use, I believe, smartphones. And my question around that is, have we discussed or have plans, have you and the CIO for the Census Bureau had some conversations around the security of whatever device is going to be used by the enumerators?
Yes, we've had consultation not only within the department, but with Homeland Security, with FBI, with the intelligence community, with the overall CIOs in the government and in commerce. So we're building in the best firewalls and routers that we possibly can. But having said that, there's probably some 13-year-old kid in a garage somewhere trying to figure out how to penetrate it. So in today's world, you do your best, but you can't be 100% sure, unfortunately.
You have to begin with the assumption of breach. I did this for a living. I never not got in. But the fact that there is, again, focus from your office on the security of these systems. And I know that there is 43 systems that have to be delivered for end-to-end testing in 2018, and only 4 of those have been delivered. And I know there's been some conversations on that. And you know, my concern is the Bureau is going to have to get the authorizations to operate, the ATOs for each one of these systems. And I know some of these, a section of these 43 systems already have ATOs, but they're going to need to get new ones because the systems is evolving. And I'm curious in the strategy that you and your IT team have discussed on ensuring that we have those ATOs in time to protect those personally identifiable information, especially on those 33 systems that do have PII.
Well, there are actually more than 50 systems that'll be involved, and then their uses are to update and maintain the address list to enable people to respond via the internet, to identify the households that have not responded in order to send interviewers to them, to manage the work of the interviewers, and to recruit and pay the field workforce. Those are just a few examples of the kinds of systems. Systems also capture, process, and tabulate all of the data collected on the people living in the United States. We're monitoring the progress of all of these systems, and each one is at a different stage of completion as we sit here.
And so what is your strategy to ensure that these systems are delivered and they have the ATOs necessary to get this done?
Well, we're trying to apply enough pressure on the contractors and enough surveillance of them to deal with the glitches that inevitably will come up. There will be unexpected problems in each area, and that's why we have allowed the 10% contingency, because most of these problems that come up can be solved. It's a question of how many people it takes and at what cost.
And Mr. Secretary, I'd like to offer that we would love to talk to those folks, those contractors that may not be delivering on time, and have them join you at this table to ensure that this census is done properly. And my last question in my remaining 2 seconds, why did the head of the census, the former director, Thompson, leave the Bureau?
Well, I think he has issued a public statement about why he left. I did not know him very well, so I can't really judge of what his motivations were. He has found other employment in the statistical community, and he actually held a press conference at the National Press Club a week or 2 after he resigned and explained what his motivations were.
Good copy. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the time I do not have.
Gentleman from Texas yields back, and I apologize again for not counting the gentleman from Texas, particularly embarrassing in a census hearing. So I apologize for that. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I don't mind you calling him the gentleman from California. We've had so many Californians move to Texas.
I should have specified the other gentleman from California, Mr. Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you so much for sticking around. I'm over here. I'm the newest member of the House and of this committee, so you sticking around is very helpful to me because I never get to ask these kind of questions. First, I'm a big fan of the census. It's a subject I studied in graduate school at the Kennedy School of Government, took classes on it. It's very important just to the entire country and how we operate. One of the issues is definitely the undercount when it comes to certain communities. African Americans were undercounted by 2.1% in 2010 and Hispanics by 1.5%. I'm fearful that that will go up in this next census because of this the immigration policies, especially the interior enforcement policies of this new administration. The acting ICE director, Homan, issued a statement last week in response to a bill that was passed in California, SB 54, the California Values Act, that they would have no choice but to conduct large-scale raids and enforcement within neighborhoods and workplaces. What kind of, and you mentioned, this also kind of made me think about, you mentioned the response rate would be 55%. Has the new interior enforcement policies of the administration been taken into account when determining the response rate, the undercount, and just trying to figure out what kind of impact it will have on these communities?
Well, there are quite a lot of questions in what you've said, but the response rate in 2010 had been 63.5%. The original estimate that the census folks had used was 60.5% this time. We took that down to 55% for the very reasons that you are describing. Is that exactly the right number? Who knows? But it certainly is a lot safer number than 60.5. So our starting point is a much more conservative one. Yeah. And as a result of that, we've allocated more money to the difficult to enumerate part. Second, we have increased the communications budget from the $350 million that was spent in 2010 to $500 million. And even if you look at 2010 on a 2020 inflation-adjusted basis, that would only bring it to $420. So it's almost a 20% increase over the inflation-adjusted basis. So we're increasing the communication is one thing. Second, we're spending $248 million on these partnership arrangements. That's over and above the $500 million that we're spending on communications. So if you add that all up, that's $750 million essentially devoted to outreach. And most of that, when you really think about it, is in fact devoted to the last few million, the last few percentage points to try to minimize the danger of undercounting. Because the ones who respond immediately to the mailings, the ones who respond immediately to a phone call, those don't cost too much to get. It's the last few that take up most of the money. We're making use of 10 different languages. We're doing all kinds of things that were not done before by way of training in order to improve the efficiency of the process.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. That was, I'm glad that's being taken into account, and I guess that's why you have a lower number. That's why the partnerships are so important. I noticed that you mentioned that only 40 partnerships specialists have been currently budgeted. In 2000, there was 590, if that's correct. What's your goal on the number of partnerships for the 2020 census?
Well, our goal is approximately 800. Our target is to get to a number on the order of magnitude of 800.
Okay. Thank you. The reason why it's so important is that there is a historic undercount in these communities. We need to make sure they're accurately counted. You have a tough job. I appreciate that there has been thought about the political environment and the immigration enforcements. What I've seen in some of my, even in talking to community hospitals and community clinics, you don't think there's a correlation, but there's some community clinics have saw increases in the no-show rate up to 19%, right? That's a big jump. So if they're not showing up to get physical and health checkups, you're going to see a lower response rate and lower counts in some of these communities. So thank you so much. I appreciate having the time to ask the questions, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, you know, around here we always say that all questions have been asked, but not by all of us here. Seeing as I appear as though I'm the last up to bat, I'll try not to repeat any more than necessary. Earlier on, Mr. Duncan apparently asked about the American Community Survey. I just want to plant something. I have the same concerns he has of intrusiveness and so on, but I also have a concern of inaccuracy. It's anecdotal, but I've been living in the same house when I'm here for years. The last census and this census, for whatever reason, they threaten my very livelihood if I don't answer questions about a place I don't live. And so the absence of a targeting pursuant to the survey that would reasonably determine whether or not there is a resident. In other words, the place that I reside in when I'm here, except for a corporate name on the title, there's no way to trace it back to anybody. It is a house that receives no mail, has no bank accounts, absolutely nothing to it. And yet, for whatever reason, it's the target of the community survey, for which I ignore, to be honest. I don't really ignore it. I take it into my staff, and they then send it to the Census Bureau to say this is silly. So the one thing that I would ask is that you, going forward, ask the question of, to get accuracy, do you have to be random and without looking, or in this modern age, can you use tools to determine the high likelihood of places that should be surveyed? Just a thought. Now here's the bigger thought. This is going to be my third survey, or sorry, my third census, and as I came in as the first census, and the gentleman from California who's departed talked about, we inherited it from the Clinton administration. And it did have some differences. In 2010, under the Bush era, and then Obama, he really inherited it from President Bush, who had done most of the preparatory work. What I'll tell you is I saw very little difference in the fact that the Census Bureau always seemed surprised that 10 years have passed. They always seem a little shocked that they didn't make it, and then they start talking about funding for something they had 10 years. So here's a question from yours and my years in business. Decades ago, when we were younger businessmen, companies closed for as much as a week to do their annual shutdown and inventories. Everybody except those counting went home. And that once-a-year inventory was the way it was. That was before a great many advances, both in statistical accuracy and in the ability to continuously monitor inventories. Today, no sensible company ever has to shut down because they are continuously making sure their inventories are accurate. The Constitution does enumerate a once every 10-year requirement, but the Constitution could be changed, if necessary, if we were to ask the question, wouldn't America be better off with continuous, accurate counting, a system in which the Census Bureau, in its many activities, including the aforementioned American Community Survey, would be constantly doing its job. It would not be trying to do something once every 10 years, which seems to be Herculean simply because they only do it once every 10 years. So I would ask you to draw on the evolutions that you've seen over decades in how we look at accounting for things and ask the question, on your watch, shouldn't we begin the process, even if it requires congressional action, to go to a continuous counting system, to make it constitutional, but to make it much more accurate, which today, with tools both in counting and, to be honest, with the modern computer accuracy of what we know and where we know it, couldn't we do the American people a better service?
Well, I must confess, with trying to get my arms around the existing process. I've not given much thought to changing the whole thing. There are probably pluses and minuses to the idea of the continual survey. At some point, I'll try to give some thought to it. But as you correctly point out, that would take a constitutional amendment. And I would think that's going to be a big challenge in and of itself, to make such a radical change in something so fundamental to the allocation of seats and allocation of monies.
I would agree with you that if, in fact, the certification once every 10 years, that the count was as accurate as it, or more accurate than it would be by the current system, would require some action. The question is, when you certify, when the Census Bureau certifies what our population is and where it is in 2020, they will be doing so with the best efforts they can have, most of which will be done based on a once every 10-year count. What I would say to you, Mr. Secretary, is if we look at what we should do for our progeny in the decades and centuries to come, if we begin now with some sort of a effective study, and of course this would be based on the people behind you for the beginning, but then a commission that would in fact check out the feasibility, run the questions, create the question of could we have a higher confidence, and could we have it every day of every month of every year, rather than the estimates today, which we rely on the estimates during the interim period. Why are they not as accurate or more accurate than the once every 10 years? So I plant this for you because your real legacy can only be affected slightly in what you do from the time you take over to the time we have our census. You have a short period of time, and most of the time has expired. But for 12 years from now, plus, there is a question of whether or not we could improve the system just as any of the portfolio of companies that you are familiar with would never close for a week once a year and think that that's the best way to count inventory.
No, I certainly agree your analogy about the private sector. That's 100% accurate. I do think that would be a very large undertaking to try to figure out the pluses and minuses of a continual thing. So I really do think that would require additional congressional appropriation. I don't want to divert any of the census people from the task at hand, because this is a heavy enough lift the way it is. So to take some of them off that job and think about a possible alternative, I really don't think is in the public's interest. So that would have to be a separate appropriation.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We got one more member to go. I'm going to go last.
Oh.
I think one thing you and I both heard today, the census is constitutionally significant. It's incredibly important for purposes of our democratic republic, counting people, apportionment, even in the apportionment of goods and services. And what I learned from you last week is this causal link between cost and compliance. The compliance numbers are going down. The cost is going up. I don't remember a lot from my childhood because it was a long time ago. I do remember the seriousness with which my parents took the census. It was almost a form of public service, maybe not to the level of jury service, but it was important. So if you accept the belief that most of our fellow citizens would like to help, particularly in an area that's constitutionally significant and important and kind of fundamental to our form of government, what are the impediments to the compliance rate? How do we reverse the trend of our fellow citizens not voluntarily complying?
Well, I can only speculate, but I'll give you a couple of thoughts on it. I think the fabric of the relationship between the public and the government has been deteriorating. I think there's less public confidence in government than there has been for a long time. And I think that's one of the problems. I think a second problem is there's so much input that comes into everyone, whether it's over social media, whether it's through the conventional media, from whatever source. I think everybody is overdosed on information flow, junk mail, the whole thing. So I think information clutter is a separate problem. And it's one of the problems even with the call center. A lot of people don't like to get incoming calls from strangers for whatever reason. And the do not call lists have proven quite ineffective. I find, even though I've only been in government a short while, I get these robocalls on my official government cell phone. I think if we want to get response rates improved, we have to get rid of a lot of the intrusions that people find in the normal course. I was astonished to get, I would say I probably get 2 or 3 junk calls a day on my official government cell phone.
Well, we might ought to switch that number, and I'm happy to help you there if you want to get a different number. Maybe it won't help. I think you put your finger on something, the disconnect between the citizenry and the government and the lack of trust, which leads to the next 2 areas. I don't think people mind answering questions where they see the relevance. How many folks live in your household? That's directly relevant to apportionment and therefore redistricting and the provision of goods and services. I made a note, you said in response to one of my colleagues, that the more questions you ask, the lower the compliance rate is. And
Absolutely.
You use the word counterintuitive, and in fact, I think it's not counterintuitive. It makes perfect sense. The longer something takes me, the less likely I am to do it. The more intrusive I view it, the less likely I am to do it.
Right.
So I would, there are 2 things. I don't want to dwell on the community survey because it's been touched upon by a number of my colleagues. It is not lost on me that American citizens can reject a jury trial. They can reject a lawyer. They can refuse to talk to the government. They can refuse to talk to law enforcement. They can refuse to vote. It is surprising to me to see that little line at the bottom of the community survey that you can be punished for failing to tell the government how many bathrooms you have and what kind of fixtures you have. So given that you and I agree that the disconnect between the citizenry and the government is one of the reasons we have a low compliance rate, I would encourage you to be very judicious and thoughtful about what questions government does ask. And the other thing I would 2 other points, and then we're done. Cost matters. It matters, period, new paragraph. I think in lots of facets of life, we're willing to pay for quality. We do it with automobiles, we do it with sporting events. I think if you were somehow able to convince our fellow citizens that they're going to get an A+ product, that you're not happy about the extra cost, but if they can swallow that, they'll get an A+ product. I think it's when you get the higher cost and a substandard product that also actually feeds that disconnect. So I don't know you well. You were kind enough to come over last week. I know nothing about your background, don't even know anything about your politics. I will tell you this, you come across as an authentic person. You come across as someone that our fellow citizens would believe on an issue like this. I would encourage you to pair up with someone who has a different political ideology, whatever yours is, find somebody on the other side. And communicate to our fellow citizens, look, we get the disconnect, we're not trying to change that. It'd be really helpful to all of us as Americans, not Republicans, not Democrats, not Southerners. It'd be helpful as Americans if we got that compliance number up. It's going to save money. It's also more accurate. So I'm not talking about an ad campaign where you're on an ad at the Super Bowl, although I'm sure you'd be great. Just use the bully pulpit of being a cabinet level official to kind of reassure our fellow citizens that you want to do it the right way and you want it to be accurate and you could use their help.
Well, I think that's very good advice, and I will try very hard to use whatever bully pulpit comes with commerce to try to achieve that.
Well, on behalf of everyone, I want to thank you, not just for today, but also the briefing you gave us yesterday. We have another panel. I know that you have other things to do, so we're going to recess and then allow the second panel to come forward. And with that, thanks on behalf of all of us for your time this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.